Hi, my name is Rachel Cohen. I'm a recent graduate of Johns Hopkins and the Southeast J Street U National Student Board representative. My involvement in J Street U began after coming home from a Tag Leap birthright trip my freshman year of college and realizing that I knew almost nothing about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I felt irresponsible, guilty really, saying that I loved Israel but avoiding dealing with the challenges that Israel faced, whatever that meant. I first learned about J Street U from a New York Times op-ed published in 2010 by Roger Cohen, and from what I read, it described exactly the sort of organization I was looking to join, and that didn't exist in any shape or form on my campus. I started the J Street U chapter at Johns Hopkins the fall of my sophomore year, and while we initially faced opposition from a small but vocal group of students who lobbied against us to the Hopkins student government, we ultimately received support from our Hill director and some other student leaders on campus. This past year, over 30 Johns Hopkins students came to the national conference. I've been lucky to have experienced some of the most invaluable opportunities that J Street U has to offer. I went back to Israel the summer after my sophomore year with J Street U and visited the West Bank for my first time. Seeing the occupation with my own eyes, understanding what it in fact looked like and what the implications of it meant, changed my life and deepened my commitment to the movement and this work. Last summer, I interned for Peter Beinart's Open Zion blog in New York, and I know I would have never been able to do that if not for my involvement as the National Communications Co-Chair for J Street U my junior year. This year, I've served on the National Student Board, and when over 900 students came to the national conference in September, and 300 more came to our first ever J Street U student town hall at Johns Hopkins this past April, it was exciting and amazing to be involved in one of the most serious forms of student political action taking place in the country today. It's amazing to watch and see where J Street U alumni go on after they graduate. The civic, leadership, and organizing skills we learn while in the movement are just ones that so many of our peers are never exposed to well in college. I'm very, very lucky and humbled and proud to be part of this organization, so thank you. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our moderator. David Waxberg is the CEO of Jewish Learning Works, formerly the Bureau of Jewish Education, San Francisco. David also serves in the Policy and Advocacy Committee of Amenu. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. It's my pleasure and privilege to be here with this distinguished panel and to discuss what is, for me, a really core issue. You all have impressive bios in your program, so I'm just going to give abbreviated bios for each of our panelists. And what we're going to have is what is in my script called a free-flowing and unscripted conversation, which is going to happen by my sort of framing the question a little bit and throwing out a question for each of the panelists and for them to discuss among themselves. And then at a certain point, we're going to open it up to you to bring in your questions as well. I've been asked to announce that if you are on Twitter, you can tweet at hashtag JST2014, and then your tweets will be shown up on the wall behind me. So, to our panel, first on my right is Merav Michaeli, who's a member of Knesset from the Labor Party. Merav is chair of the caucus of female Knesset members and a member of the Foreign Affairs Defense Committee of the Knesset. Next to Merav is Rabbi Sharon Brous, the founding rabbi of IKAR, a leading-edge Jewish community in Los Angeles. Sharon also sits on the faculty of the Hartman Institute North America, Wexner Heritage, and Reboot. And next to Sharon is Dr. David Myers, professor of Jewish history at UCLA, where he serves as the Robert N. Burr Chair of the History Department. David has authored and edited several books and writes frequently on Jewish matters and on Israel. All have impressive titles, which I'm going to dispense with for efficiency and just refer to them as Merav, Sharon, and David. So we're talking about beyond the tent, what's the responsibility of American Jews for Israel's future? And I want to begin with telling you a story of a meeting I was at about a month ago with a group of Jewish executives here in the Bay Area. And a director of one of the local Hillels was sharing her challenges of supporting Jewish kids on campus. And among those challenges, in one sentence, she listed a gamut of assaults on Jews in Israel that began with BDS movement and ended with J Street U. So my ears perked up, and one of my colleagues, actually another educator, said, I'm uncomfortable with a sentence that begins with BDS and ends with J Street as if they're the same thing. So the Hillel director responded by saying, I'm just describing things that are outside the norm. Now, when I heard that, my ears really perked up. I live here, and in my own experience, normal, my best definition of the word normal is it's a setting on a washing machine. So I asked the question, what's the norm? Well, now it was game on, and the entire meeting then sort of became this huge fray conversation about how we relate to Israel. It turned out actually to be the most honest and constructive and respectful conversation about Israel I've ever had with a group of Jewish leaders. One rabbi in the room, who was actually no fan of J Street, likened our relationship with Israel to that of family. Family relationships can be difficult, even dysfunctional, but when you're family, there's no escaping. You're committed to it and to working things out no matter what. You're connected intrinsically, and you feel your fates bound together, which is actually something that later resonated in a comment that Merav sent to me in an email when we were discussing this panel. You don't always like one another, but you love each other. That's unshakable. That's forever. And among the challenges that families have difficulty with are boundary issues. So no one among our diverse backgrounds and orientations could argue with the family metaphor. And this returned to me this past week, as I said, as we were discussing this conference and this panel. And I was discussing my participation with all sorts of people who shared a variety of opinions and concerns about J Street. Another way to think about boundary issues is, what are our rights and responsibilities toward each other? What are the ties and obligations that bind us? And what do these obligations demand and permit in terms of our engagement in the affairs of the other? So these are the questions that I think are inherent in the title of this session. What's the nature of our relationship? What are we called to do and not to do? And I'm going to throw that first question out to each of our panelists. I'm going to begin with David, who, as a historian and student of American Jewry, can I hope provide some background on this relationship and how it's evolved to where we are today.
Great. Well, thank you very much, David. And I just want to express my gratitude at being here with you all in this wonderful setting where we can speak openly and honestly. And I particularly want to commend a truly inspiring group of people amongst us, the members of J Street U, who have really, I think, modeled the kind of effort to secure what I often call the sane center between two extreme positions. I'm really here in the wake of my own daughter, who was a member of J Street U before graduating college. She's not here today, she's on the East Coast, but I really want to just express my gratitude to J Street U for all that it does, especially on college campuses. So I really cotton to the family metaphor, David, I have to say. Let me be stark and perhaps provocative. The occupation is pushing Israel off a cliff. We have a moral obligation as members of a shared family to express ourselves, our concern, and our suggestions about how to mend that which is broken. I imagine Jews in the diaspora and Jews in Israel as part of a single family. I would say as part of a single global Jewish nation. Here I'm very much inspired by someone whom we mentioned in the brief conversation we had before the session, an underappreciated but really great 20th century Jewish thinker by the name of Shimon Ravidovich, who wrote a famous book in 1957 entitled Bavel v'Yushalayim, Babylon and Jerusalem, the figurative diaspora and the figurative homeland, both of which were equal partners in the idea of a global Jewish nation. I believe that indeed in today's world, in today's globalized world, we can and should speak of a single global nation of which we are part. And when one member of that nation is ill or in a dangerous position, it strikes me that it is not only our right but obligation to call attention to that malady and to seek remedy. So I begin with that core proposition. From the perspective of an historian, it is indeed the case that we have rarely spoken in a single uniform voice with regard to Zionism or the land of Israel. I mean, we can go back to ancient times, we can go back to the Mishnah, we can go back to the time of Hillel and Shammai, of whom it was said, Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim chayim. These words and those words are the words of a living God, so as to empower the very notion of multiple voices. But when I think of the origins of Zionism, I think of an entity that was born in multiplicity. There was not a single Zionist vision at the inception of the movement. Theodor Herzl had this vision of a political Zionism that inspired many, but left others, for example, one of his great opponents, Achad Ha'am, feeling like a mourner at a wedding feast at the first Zionist Congress. And shortly after Achad Ha'am, along comes socialist Zionism. And then in response to both socialist Zionism and cultural Zionism, we have religious Zionism. So already within the first 5 years of the movement, we have 4 major strands, all of which were involved in a cacophonous discussion and debate about what the essence of Zionism was. Now, if we turn our attention to American Jews and their attitude towards Zionism, let's just take a 100-year period. I think we can profitably divide that 100-year period into 4, maybe 5 divisions. We'll begin in 1917 with the Balfour Declaration, the first major act of international legitimation of the Zionist movement. Between 1917 and 1948, I think we can see a gradual coalescing of support for the Zionist project after a period in which Zionism was very much a minority entity within American Judaism. How does that occur? Well, over the course of the 1930s and even more powerfully over the 1940s, American Jews recognized that a place of refuge for the Jewish people in the land of Israel is a necessity. And so we see, especially in the 1940s, the crystallization of American Jewish support for the Zionist project, culminating in 1948 with the establishment of the State of Israel. Crowning achievement in modern Jewish history, and a moment at which Jews the world over, regardless of their earlier views about the wisdom of Zionism, for the most part came together in support of that historic moment. From 1948 to 1967, I think we can see countervailing vectors. On one hand, we see the emergence of new institutions devoted to fortifying diaspora and American Jewish support for Israel, institutions like AIPAC, founded in 1951, or the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations, founded in 1955. But we also know of the famous Ben-Gurion-Blaustein Agreement of 1950, in which Ben-Gurion and Jacob Blaustein, the head of the American Jewish Committee, agreed that American Jewish loyalties were owed to America, not to the State of Israel. American Jews were American in the first instance. They could manifest their support for Israel in a variety of forms, but in terms of core political loyalties, America was the site of identification. So we see countervailing vectors in the 1950s. We also see what is perhaps the most important movement in American Judaism and Jewry of that period, suburbanization, occurring, which means that American Jews are preoccupied with building synagogues and civic organizations in their communities. And so a little bit less attention is devoted to the relationship to Israel. That period of countervailing vectors comes to an end in 1967, another hugely galvanizing moment. The Israeli victory in the Six-Day War, averting what many thought to be imminent destruction and tragedy, served to really empower Jews the world over to express their pride in the Jewish nation and the Jewish ethnicity. And indeed set in motion, at least for a spell, a sense of communal unity. The United Nations resolution that equated Zionism with racism in 1975 was also a galvanizing moment that brought together the organized Jewish community on behalf of a kind of singular vision. I would say that period of relative unity that began in 1967 begins to unravel in 1982. 1982 is the first Lebanon War. Both in Israel and in the diaspora, this is a moment at which prior consensus about the necessity of Israeli military action begins to evaporate. And I think it opens up, once again, what had become an increasingly narrow range of vision on the part of diaspora Jewry towards Israel. In the same period, we have intense new debates that issue initially from Israel and the Israeli chief rabbinate about the question, who is a Jew? We also have the Jonathan Pollard affair in 1987. All of these events begin to open up the conversation anew, produce new fissures within American Jewry, and certainly between American Jewry and Israel, and I think lead to the emergence of those multiple voices that were present from the inception of the Zionist movement, in a certain sense a return to what was in that original phase. So how do we get to this point that you've described where multiplicity of voices seems to be illegitimate and we're called upon to hew to one particular line? Well, I think it's precisely the anxiety over those multiple voices in a time when Israel has become increasingly isolated in the world. I think the convergence of those two, plus one other factor, which is the thinning or diminution, narrowing of American Jewish identity itself, such that Israel, at least for those who dwell within the bubble of the organized Jewish community, Israel becomes, in a certain sense, the essence of Jewish identity. I think those three factors together, animated by a sense of anxiety, lead to that narrowing in the midst of this opening that began in 1982. And it seems to me that's where we're at today.
All right, so then we come to today. Thank you, David. Actually, before I thank you, David. Before we move on, one housekeeping note. I understand there are question cards being distributed. So feel free to jot a question down. Someone will pick them up, and eventually they'll come here, and if you're lucky, it'll get read. Okay, Sharon, I want to move to you next. So that brings us to today. And my question to you as clearly an influential leader is to reflect a little bit about the meaning of this relationship and how you see how we are called as American Jews in this relationship to act, and how you would guide your congregants and others that look to you.
So thank you so much, and I'm so happy to be here also with all of you today. As David said, I think very, very beautifully and pointedly, this is a moment of great tension, because we have on one hand a sort of disappearance of Jews from the Jewish fold in the United States, and in particular young Jews. And as we see, even up to a third of the Jews who are considered millennials in their 20s and 30s, totally disconnecting from Jewish communal life, from Jewish religious life. And at the other side, a sort of shrinking or narrowing sense of what it means to actually be in relationship with Israel, and yet a real reluctance in the institutional Jewish world to connect the dots between those two. I wouldn't say that one is necessarily the cause of the other, but they're certainly related to one another. So what I encounter in my interactions with a lot of young people is probably very similar to what many of you have seen, which is a growing perception among young Jews in particular that the American Jewish community has essentially lost its moral standing, is no longer willing to engage in a serious conversation about moral right, and instead it lives in a very narrow space of standing and supporting Israel no matter what the conditions. And that's something that really, I think, turns a lot of people off. I spoke the other day with somebody who told me, very similar to Rachel's story actually, that that after experiencing birthright, she came back and she grew up actually very strongly identified as a Jew with a sense of connection to Israel, but had never gone before. She went there as a young person and then came home and started reading the newspaper. And her first reaction was, the New York Times, they're anti-Semites. How could they say these things about Israel? And eventually started to learn more and read more and had no capacity to respond to a much more complex and nuanced conversation, and eventually went on to become a part of the Palestine Solidarity movement and took very strong stances against the Jewish community, against the Zionist community on her campus. She didn't know that there was a way to be in relationship with Israel, to be in love with Israel even, and also to hold her progressive values as truths as well. So now she's learning this many years later, and I think that there are so many people who find themselves in this place as well. So what we're trying to do is establish a language for, or to amplify a language. We're not the ones writing it, but really just helping give voice to it. A language in which people can feel a deep sense of connection to Israel as a homeland, as a heartland, and also understand that part of our obligation as Jewish people, even though we live in the safety and security of Los Angeles and San Francisco, which is what I hear every single time I write anything about Israel, people who have not only a right but also an obligation to engage in this conversation for all of our sake. And so to be able to produce a conversation or create space for a conversation where people are actually able to hold multiple truths at the same time is what our objective is.
Thank you. So you both sort of touched on the one hand, David, you spoke about this condition of isolation of Israel, which actually a number of people have said to me, well, to criticize Israel in that context, it feels like piling on. On the other hand, Sharon, you've pointed out, particularly among many young Jews, if they don't see, for lack of a better word, a third way, if the one hand looks untenable to them, they're going to go all the way to the other if they don't see a way of actually being engaged with and supporting Israel in a living way that enables them to address tough issues. So Merav, what I want to ask you as a citizen of Israel and a member of Knesset, what you look for from us in this relationship, and what's the appropriate engagement for American Jews in Israel's most profound questions, and what, if any, are the limits?
Thank you, David, and thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure being here with you. I want to, with your permission, try and do the parallel thing to what David did from the Israeli side, even though I never researched it. But I can, I think, give the personal experience. Generally speaking, I think it's safe to say that Israeli general public doesn't have a consciousness of the American Jewish Committee on regularly. I know I'm not supposed to touch this, so just, okay. I would even say, and of course they have no idea of the complexity and the composition of the Jewish community in America and the extent of it, and really, since J Street, since the beginning of J Street, there is much more mention of J Street and IKAR in Israeli media, but it's still very small. But up until then, it didn't exist in the day-to-day life of Israelis. I'm thinking of myself, and it didn't even sort of register to me. My first acquaintance with the US was through the Scouts delegation, which I was on in '83. I came here at 16 and a half, not here, but to Florida, West Palm Beach. As an Israel specialist, I was a counselor at a day camp, and I didn't realize I mean, I knew what I was doing. I was being a missionary person, explaining how Israel is the most fabulous place on earth, the most righteous place on earth. We grew up with this strong notion that the only way to be a real Jew is to be an Israeli. Yep. And all the rest is like, it's not the real thing, and it lacks like a very deep essence, an understanding of life, actually. So that's what we did, and we didn't get anything back. I can safely say that I went back to Israel with no new understanding of the Jewish community in America after, mind you, 3 months, not 3 weeks or 3 days. But I did love it. I have to tell you, I didn't want to go back. It was just perfect. And then, now, let me skip to the first convention of J Street. I was very little head. I hope it doesn't imply anything else. Okay. Then, for the past, I think since 2001, I was coming to the States, to New York actually, quite often, like 2-3 times a year, because of life, whatever. And this one time, I'm in New York, and I meet these new people, young Jews, who tell me about this thing, J Street, how they're about the two-state solution, and they're like all leftist. And everyone sounds so enthusiastic about it. And so I go to I get myself invited to the convention as leftist, journalist, whatever. And I write to, actually a few days before that, since I had a column on Haaretz editorial page, I write my column, and I write my columns, and I write this op-ed saying, Israelis only know 2 kinds of American Jews, those who give money and are rich and are sort of conservative, and those who don't care. But actually, there is a 3rd kind. They are contemporary, they are leftist, they care about Israel, but they care about it in a different way, and they now are trying to make their voice heard, and that is what's happening now, J Street, this new amazing thing. And I send it and I go to bed because of the time differences. I get up in the morning to find this furious email from my editor. You know nothing what you are talking about. Stick to what you understand. There is only 2 kinds of Jews in America. Those who give money and are conservative, and those who don't care. I call him and I try to explain to him that, I too wasn't aware of that. But really, I met those people, they're real. And he says to me, if you're worried about your space, don't worry, we'll keep it for you. And he never published the op-ed. To this day, it's a little bit irrelevant, a little bit. But, so the way, and he's not, and this editor, who I don't want to bash him, so I will not tell you who he was, but really is not someone old and, that doesn't have sort of but he really, the way we usually are, we see the things that we've believed in to begin with. That's how deep the lacking of understanding of what's really happening within the American Jewish community was in Israel. I do have to say that unfortunately it still is the situation with our prime minister. That hasn't changed over the past 5 years. So now when I was elected, and I was elected almost a year and a half ago, yes, thank you. I only came into formal politics then, and I came to New York, and I had a meeting with now I was aware, so I already had some sense of a little bit of what's happening in the Jewish community, even though much more the leftist part of it. And then I started, and the consul made me this huge list of contacts, people that I should meet. And I started getting to know all of these people who you already knew them. like Malcolm Online, like Nancy Kaufman, like David Harris, all of these people. And it's like this amazing world was discovered to me. I felt like Columbus a little bit. And ever since then, I became extremely interested and deeply engaged within the different parts. And I hope it's okay, I also went to AIPAC this year, okay? And realizing how little even most of Israeli politicians know about American Jewish community. So when I have to think about, now, given that still the basic notion is that since Israel is a very narcissistic place, after all, and most of us as Israelis are very narcissistic, then still the notion is that the right kind of Jew is Israeli, unless you live to go live even here, but you still remain an Israeli. You don't become Jewish, you remain Israeli. Now, since in Israel we had this split that we have secular people, and most secular people will define themselves more Israeli than Jews. This is something very, very strong in Israel because there was the split that the rabbinic institution took over, the Orthodox rabbinic institution took over whatever is Jewish. Then really most secular Israelis will say that they are first and foremost Israeli, only then are they Jewish. So this creates a sort of, I would say, a gap between most secular Israeli Jews and Jews elsewhere in the world. I mean, on one hand, we patronize over, because we are the Salem, the safe haven, and you're all supposed to come to us when you're in trouble. And so it's our sort of responsibility, and it gives us an excuse to why we need to keep the state of Israel secure, because ultimately you will all need it, because we are constantly on the verge of existential extermination. So there's this huge gap in which Israelis in general, if you would ask most Israelis what do they expect from Jewish American community, they have no idea, but they definitely do not expect criticism. But then again, they do not expect criticism from anyone. So now there are more questions than answers, but let's continue and then, okay?
Well, that provokes an... Thank you, Merav.
David?
Go ahead, David.
I have a proposal, just a modest proposal, that sort of flies in the face of your Florida experience. I've been to Florida only once, so I can't attest to what goes on there, but I would suggest to you it may not be characteristic of what goes on in the rest of America. So my proposal is, in order to begin to deepen the ties of mutuality that need to exist for a healthy relationship and overcome a deeply rooted negationist impulse that has its origins in early Zionism, that is to say, negating of the diaspora, why don't we rethink one of the great successes of recent Jewish organizational life, birthright, taglit, and make it multi-directional? Bring Israelis to America to learn a little bit about what goes on in Israel, and send kids to Melbourne and Paris and Montevideo, and really effect that global Jewish nation.
By all means, Israelis will be happy to go.
But they would have to leave after 10 days.
They have to go back, that's the problem. Yes. Sharon, I was wondering if you had any comments on Merav's observations. Although I should say that if you want to understand American life, just go to West Palm Beach, and every community is exactly that way.
Well, we had a group of Israelis who came to visit at our Shabbat services at IKAR a couple weeks ago. They were fellows. They said it was the equivalent of the Wexner Fellowship, but designed to do exactly what David's proposing, to bring young Israelis in their 20s to the United States to learn about Jewish life. And I was talking to them afterwards, and they said one of the men explained to me that he grew up Orthodox in Jerusalem. Never before had he conceived of the idea that Judaism extends outside of the walls of the synagogue. That for him, his Jewish life was what he did in shul on Shabbat. And then the rest of the week, he's Israeli. And then he's a Jew again when the sun goes down on Friday night. And what he experienced was a sort of, he said that he was learning from this Shabbat experience that it's about a worldview. It's about saying, what do these texts and these traditions have to inform us about what it means to be a Jew and a human being in the world, which is a totally different set of questions. He said, I never would contemplate, how as a Jew should I vote in this election? What are my key moral concerns and values, and how might those manifest themselves in the public square? That's not part of his consideration, which I thought was very interesting, and just one of the many things that might arise.
Right, in addition to which, a notion of pluralism as a Jewish value, which is a very foreign concept to many Israelis on both ends of that dichotomy. Religious as well as secular.
Yes.
I mean, that very dichotomy doesn't have the same resonance at all in the United States. We fill in, there are many deficiencies and ailments plaguing American Jewry. We shouldn't delude ourselves about that. But at least we have that large, shall we call it, colorful gray area between these two poles, which just anecdotally, I find when my Israeli graduate students come and spend time in Los Angeles, they, to a person, say, I sort of have discovered what it means to be a Jew. So I think there is something very valuable to be learned, especially between those very dichotomous poles. So we really want to think of ways in which we can encourage an appreciation for the values of pluralism as they manifest itself in Judaism and beyond, and bring that back to Israel. That would be a very valuable
Okay, so
undertaking.
this takes us, of course, to the big thing of state and religion in Israel, because like amazingly and horribly in a way, Israel is the only place in the world where there is no Jewish pluralism. Now this, it sounds funny, but really, seriously, we have in Israel this dichotomy, like you say, between, we don't have modern Orthodox, this is something that we don't have at all. We have one in the Knesset, his name is Dov Lipman, he belongs to Yair Lapid's party, he's very sweet, and he's the model. But other than that, we have ultra-Orthodox, Orthodox who are becoming increasingly settler Orthodox, almost exclusively, and we have secular. Now, we have tiny, or not so tiny, but like congregations, Reform and Conservative, who get no recognition from the state. Not only, they don't get not only in the sense that they cannot determine who's Jewish or not, and that they cannot marry, and that they cannot convert, etc., but that they don't get government funding the way, of course, the ultra-Orthodox and the Orthodox do. Now, this again creates this, it eliminates this huge, what should have been a common ground between Israelis and American Jews. And it alienates, rightfully, many American Jews who can't get married in Israel, who are being questioned for their Jewishness or for their kosherness or whatever. This is something, by the way, that Israel needs to resolve regardless of its relationship with the American Jewish community. The fact that we still don't have civil marriage in Israel is really, really outraging. And this is, it has to go, it goes, it's relevant for human rights, for equality between women and men. It's like relevant for tons of other reasons, but also for the relationship with diaspora Jews.
This is why that issue was one of three major issues mentioned as most prominent in the recent study by the Jewish People Policy Institute that came out of Tzipi Livni's request of Ruth Gavison to rethink the nature of the relationship between Jewish and Democratic. One issue was indeed the absence or lack of pluralism in the sphere of religion. A second concern of diaspora Jews. The report basically was focused on a series of focus groups and discussions held with the organized leadership of many diaspora communities who expressed concern about three things: the absence of pluralism in the religious sphere, the treatment of the Palestinian-Israeli minority, and the occupation. And I would suggest that as we understand the importance of pluralism in the Jewish denominational sphere, we should also understand that it sort of bleeds out to those other extraordinarily important issues that really stand at the heart of what it means to be Jewish and democratic. So it's not that American Jewry has the unique purchase on pluralism and tolerance, but it is that we recognize certain features in American society that might be of benefit to Israeli society, or certain features in Israeli society about which we might be able to say something profitably, and do so as family members, concerned about the commonweal, about the well-being of the larger Jewish nation.
So I want to get to what I think is perhaps one of the most irritating points of this issue. If we're talking about the ability or the right or the responsibility of American Jews to speak out publicly, even in disagreement with the Israeli government, that issue becomes far more acute when there's daylight between the and growing daylight between the position of the Israeli government and that of the United States government. And that has been the case of late. And I would love to hear actually from each of you, particularly on this question, where we're not just saying, well, we think this is bad, we disagree with this, but actually we're going to go and talk to people on Capitol Hill, we're going to go talk to the White House, the State Department, and share with them that we think this is the way to go, even though the Israeli government is saying this is the way. That becomes then something far more, it seems to me, problematic from an Israeli perspective. And I'd love to hear from you, and I'd love to hear from you how that both creates more difficulty, and also what's the way out, what's the way forward.
I'm not sure I have the answer to that, seriously. I don't know, because I am troubled by, if a little bit of the bigger picture. What does it mean for Israel if it doesn't have a vibrant, strong, effective Jewish community in the US? What does it mean for the American Jewish community if it doesn't have Israel as, doesn't matter, a safe haven possibly, or a troublemaker thing, for your Jewish identity? Mm-hmm. Seriously, I'm not kidding this time. So I'm not sure, and I know this sometimes instinct to say, if you care about us so much, come make Aliyah, we'll give you a lot of money and you can vote. You can just vote. And vote for labor and we will make peace. And but then on the other hand, of course, there's those people who say, we're good enough for you to take our money, so you may as well listen to what we have to say. So I don't know if I have the answer to this, seriously. I just know that I also hear those who say, now you think, you're sure that what you want to make the U.S. government do is for the best interest of Israel. But, so now the administration really does want to do something that you think is good for Israel. But what if the administration wants to do something that you think is not good for Israel? So it's so, I don't know, it's very tricky.
Well, I guess there's a kind of cost-benefit analysis that everybody undertakes in trying to understand what's legitimate and reasonable to pursue. So on one hand, there is sort of the communal mantra, never break step with the organizational position, the position of the organized community. That's the 614th commandment, if you will. On the other hand, if the alternative is to see Israel continue down a path that is extraordinarily perilous, I would return to our own sense of moral and political obligation to do what we can to prevent it from continuing down that path.
Yes.
Everybody has to undertake that balancing act on her or his own terms. Mm-hmm. For me, it seems absolutely clear It also seems clear to me that just about the only thing that can save Israel from following that path is a strenuous intervention by the United States in the second tenure of a president. That is to say, when we have a second-term president, as we do now, because of the political implications. And even then, the political capital that would have to be expended to do what I think needs to be done may be more than most, if not all, presidents would consider doing. But it seems to me that you have this balancing act to engage in. I understand the impulse of not speaking ill or stepping out of line in the presence of others, as it were. But that impulse is far outweighed by the other impulse, the impulse of concern, of a sense of desperate urgency that I and others feel. So that's one way to answer the question. The other is that I'm not an agent of the Israeli government. And I don't say that as it should be quite clear by now, I'm not an agent of the Israeli government. But I don't say that dismissively. It's actually a principled point. The point is, my sense of deep connection to that place is not to the government. It's to the people, the land, the culture, the history. Therein lies my sense of connection. I must confess, I don't fetishize the state qua state. States are instruments to advance certain ends that I think can be very noble, but aren't always. I'm not interested in idealizing that instrument that actually acts on behalf of sometimes higher ends. I'm interested in the higher ends. I'm also interested in the people-to-people connections. That's what, for me, is most significant in the relationship. Sharon talks about being in relationship with Israel. It's not about being in relationship with the Ministry of Absorption. It's about being in relationship with people, a language, a culture, a spiritual tradition, a history. And I think that adds a different dimension to our conversation about how to connect.
I just, with your permission, hearing you describing your relationship or connection to the land, to the people, to the tradition, to the history, and don't take this as an insult, please, but that was my association, makes me think of Moscovich, that is giving so much money to right-wing NGOs to buy Palestinian property in Jerusalem, in the territories, and that is, I mean, it goes straight to this description that you just gave. So unfortunately, it goes both ways.
Right, but we have to reclaim that notion of Eretz Israel from the likes of Moscovich.
By all means.
Who have hijacked it completely.
By all means.
Right, and not surrender it to the likes of Moscovich. I mean, it seems to me absolutely clear we have to demonstrate the depth of our commitments, and they're no less passionate than those of the Moscoviches. He channels it in his way, but we have to reclaim precisely that sense of commitment to the land, but then engage in our own cost-benefit analysis, our reverence for the land against our commitment to the rights of others who are native to that land as well.
I also think there's just a nuance of difference here. There's many people that sort of talk about the land in contradistinction to the state. I think what I'm hearing David say is not that. You're talking about whatever particular governing coalition or whatever particular group is in power at that moment is a different thing than the country as a whole, which includes the state, by the way.
Yeah, and of course various people will define as a whole very differently.
Yeah. Right.
I have a much more minimalist notion of as a whole.
I'm not talking geographically,
right,
though. Yeah.
David, I just wanted to
Sharon,
jump in
please.
for a second, which is I would feel much more uncomfortable about American Jews lobbying with particular positions on Israel if there not Israelis who were also advocating the same positions on the ground. And so, Merav, I don't know if you fully know the impact that your inaugural speech had on the American Jewish community last year, but when we hear and see activists like you who are speaking and really preaching with all of your heart to try to help manifest the greatest aspirations of Israel's own founders, and every day living out those values yourself and fighting for them. I believe that is what strengthens the American Jewish community to stand up and fight for these values ourselves. So we're not shooting in the dark here. I believe that part of the responsibility of the American Jewish community is to support activists like you who are working to achieve the same ends in Israel.
Thank you so much. So on that note, and again, I'm saying it seriously, I want to reach out to you and tell you that ever since I came into the formal politics, it became so crystal clear to me that the huge difference between the support that the right wing in Israel have from the right wing parts of American Jewish community, as opposed to the smaller support that the left has. And that is in every possible way. It's because, for many reasons that you can probably tell yourselves, but we do need you. We do need you to be more supportive of the left, not necessarily of the two-state solution, because I don't know what will happen with the two-state solution. Maybe it's not the only solution possible, maybe whatever, many things can happen, but support the progressive camp, as much as it may look not maybe exactly the way you want it to look like, because too often as leftists, we tend to be very picky if it's not and the feminists in the audience should know that even better, so that if it's not like a 100% exactly what you can feel that you can identify with, then you do not want to align yourself with it. So try to be less picky. We're doing our best, and we need your support and I have to tell you something, there's this narrative of there's no alternative for Bibi, no leadership that can challenge Bibi. That is not true, actually. And the opposition in Israel has, in a long time, hasn't been as effective and as vocal as it is now. And I need you to start saying that there is an alternative, and that will help us believe that there is an alternative, and we can keep this going back and forth.
David, may I just
Go ahead.
I'm sorry. Sometimes I despair. I despair that the vision, that bold vision that inspired so many generations, has lapsed. And then I see a younger generation of Israelis who will not allow themselves the luxury of despair, who believe in working, and this is the important point, within the bounds of legitimate political discourse, not outside it, very consciously within it, in order to effect change, with a long-term vision that is absolutely breathtaking from people of their generation. And you're included in that extended generation.
Oh, thank you. That is very flattering to me, age-wise. Yes.
But what is important, and Sharon made this point, is we spend a lot of time talking about the ailments of Israel. As occasional writers for the Los Angeles Jewish Journal, who write articles that are written 1,000 times a day in Israel without incident, we know how vibrant Israeli political discourse is on matters that are of keen interest to us. And it's really empowering to us, actually, to see how things that we're pilloried for, without exception, are really uttered with the greatest of frequency in Israel. So we really have to acknowledge the extraordinary vibrancy of Israeli political discourse and understand that we derive a great deal of energy and inspiration from that as well.
So I actually want to talk about that a little bit. Sharon used the word discomfort earlier, and we're a disputatious people, and David referenced something from Talmud, which talks about this multiple opinions about just about everything. I'm an educator, and one of the things that we do is Israel education. And one of the things we found in many schools when we started on this is that a lot of people just didn't want to talk about Israel. They didn't want to teach about Israel because it did nothing other than get them into trouble. And I have a colleague in another city who, we have a program here called One Bay, One Book, where we choose a book and the whole community talks about it. Reads it and we discuss it, and they were doing something similar in another city, and he said, well, we were looking at Shavit's book, My Promised Land, but actually I checked in with several rabbis and they counseled me not to choose My Promised Land because it is so provocative that it's just going to cause problems, so we're not going to do that. And a couple of years ago, Rabbi Sharon Brous wrote, actually I thought, a very beautiful piece during the conflict with Gaza, that I thought was absolutely not controversial whatsoever, and it kicked up a huge firestorm. And one of the takeaways from all of this is I'm just not going to talk about it.
Yeah.
And since this is what I either hear or actually don't hear from a lot of your colleagues, I want to hear a little bit more when we talk about our responsibility to Israel's future. Mm-hmm. And you just referenced all these people in Israel, including the person on my right, who are speaking out and speaking up to try to better Israel's future. And we talk about the word responsibility. I'm curious to know what your suggestion is, both for your colleagues and for the rest of us, in terms of sometimes this disputatious fact.
So one of my colleagues, Rabbi Scott Perlow, who's at Sixth and I in D.C., I think he coined the phrase a few years ago, the Death by Israel sermon, which is like what every rabbi dreads. And I'm very lucky we founded our community, and Daniel Sokach is one of my founders, and David Myers is another. And so I don't have fear when I give a sermon that I'm, going to be fired. But I did give a sermon the other day, maybe 2 months ago, in support of the 30,000 Israelis who stood in solidarity with the asylum seekers in Israel and talked about what I believed was our moral obligation as Jews and as a Jewish state. And somebody approached me after services and put her finger in my face and said, "You are a disgrace to the Jewish people and a danger to the state of Israel." And I said, "How about Kiddush? We've got pretzel challah here. It's LA, the land of plenty." So, but it occurred to me afterwards, I admit, that this was a visitor, and if that had been 4 of my board members, I would. I mean, there's no way you can't think twice before giving the next sermon. So, look, this is not easy. I will say, when my initial conflict erupted about a year and a half ago, I received several hundred letters of hate mail, handwritten, misogynistic, anti-Semitic even, incredibly threatening letters naming my children, naming my husband, very scary. I was scared to walk out the door of my house. I also realized that, and that what I wrote was not controversial in any way, and yet there was subsequently an entire issue of the Jewish Journal dedicated to unpacking this controversy, which David Myers, thankfully, was the very first person who wrote a letter in support and response, which I will remember forever. But it was called, the title, the cover story was "The Compassion Controversy." And I held it and I was screaming, "There's no controversy over compassion. This is not controversial." Because what I had essentially written was, Israel has a right and an obligation to defend itself and its people. That's what it means to be a state. Thank God we have an apparatus that's able to do that. Also, the Palestinians are human beings. And as Jews, we don't celebrate when even our enemies are destroyed. So this was what I wrote to be labeled a traitor in the Jewish community. Okay, but what I learned from this is really a kind of obvious irony, which I don't think I had been so clear about before, which is that the American Jewish community has cast its lot with a version of Zionism that would not ultimately include most American Jews, were we to, God forbid, either need refuge in the state of Israel or decide to make Aliyah one day because it's retirement and it's time to go. In other words, so when we screened The Gatekeepers at IKAR, which is an incredible film, and Dror Moreh spoke, the filmmaker, afterwards, and he said, everybody asks me, why did you make this film? And my answer is, because I'm an Israeli, and my children are Israelis, and I love this country too much to give up on it. So I called one of my family members who's on the board of a conservative synagogue, and I said, you must screen this film. This is really important. And she said, we don't film anti-Israel propaganda. We don't screen it. And I said, you're more of a Zionist than the 6 former heads of the Shin Bet. This is the obvious irony of American Jewry, which is we want to support only this ultra-nationalist, extremely restrictive and non-pluralistic version of Israel that ultimately would not embrace even us. Now, I see it as a person who loves Israel deeply, that's where I see the moral obligation to actually stand up and speak out, to work with New Israel Fund and others to identify on the ground Israelis who are fighting for civil society, for democracy, for pluralism, for equality, so that we can actually help strengthen Israelis who are working toward the aspirations of Israel's greatest dreams.
So I have some questions from our friends here. The first one, and the first one is directed to both of you, although feel free to jump in. And this is, I think, from a J Street U student. And the question is, what would you say to J Street students? Why should we play a frontline role opposing BDS when the organized community slaps us in the face by rejecting J Street's application to the Conference of Presidents? And when the organized community didn't do more to convey their support for Kerry's peace efforts. So that's the question.
So I would say to begin that the Conference of Presidents made a very foolish decision that I think bespeaks how out of touch it is with the reality of American Jewry. And it really is not a reflection on the virtues of J Street, but really a reflection of how detached from reality I think it is. Because there are indeed different circles of Jewish identification in this country, and alas, the conference is attuned only to the tightest, most insulated circle, which reflects, I think, a very small percentage of American Jews. So I wouldn't see that as a reflection of the virtue of J Street at all. Because I think there is virtue in holding to what, again, I call the sane center position. And we should really maybe embark on a rebranding mission to use this idea of sort of reclaiming the center. There are, on one hand, those who say that Israel is incapable of the slightest transgression in the world. It dwells in a world of moral perfection. That is the position of those who occupy the right end of the Israel advocacy project. And it too seems utterly detached from reality. It has no moral or political credibility. On the other hand, there are those who seem to deem Israel to be the sole criminal actor on the international stage. Mm-hmm. And that seems disproportionate and wrong too, and quite oblivious of what's going on in the neighborhood, I might say. And I'm often struck by that. As someone who spends the bulk of his time criticizing the occupation, I'm struck by the opacity of those at that end of the spectrum to what goes on in the world around. I mean, just a little bit northeast, or a little bit southeast, or a little bit south. You don't have to go too far. That singularity of focus is unnerving. I would not rush to brand it anti-Semitic, necessarily, but it's unnerving. And therefore, I think that we need people who have an adequate balance between contextual sensitivity and political nuance on one hand, and people whose moral compass is still operating. That's the position of J Street U. Yes. And there it should dwell, between those two positions. It's a moral imperative, it's a political necessity, and it's a manifestation of exactly that familial connection that I think we all deem so important.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Did you want to add?
Yeah, I just add, I mean, I don't believe that the reason to oppose BDS is to gain standing for your own organization or support for your own, to amplify your own name. You oppose BDS because it's not right, because it's not the right way to resolve this problem. And I think, I mean, we have to use our moral voice because we see something before us that we need to speak out about. And sometimes that might enhance our standing in the world, and other times it might diminish our standing in the world. Nevertheless, we have to speak out when we have to speak out. And so I don't think it's a fair analysis necessarily that I'm willing to speak out against BDS only if you include J Street in the tent, but otherwise I won't use my voice that way. If you're opposed to BDS, oppose BDS. And eventually we all, many people have now written about how the exclusion of J Street from the tent, so to speak, only proved how irrelevant the tent is, right? So the righteousness of this idea of a sane center, which I love the phrasing of, that is very clear now. I mean, this is the direction that the community is moving in now. People who care deeply, love deeply, care about humanity, care deeply about the Jewish community, and are unwilling to give up on the possibility that we might eventually become all that we think we can and should become. So I believe that if you're opposed to an idea, you don't oppose it vocally only to support and enhance your own standing. You oppose it vocally because God gave you a voice, so use it.
Yeah, J Street U are the coolest, smartest, most inspiring young people I know. We're all going to get behind you, get out in front on this, and take us to where we need to go.
So I have a question for Merav, but before I have another question sort of related, and it's to David Myers in particular. It's from one of your former students who writes that he's here because of the education he received from UCLA when you were his or her professor. Then the question is, within an increasingly polarizing environment on college campus, what role does faculty have in this conversation?
I'm going to let Sharon answer that one.
I will not touch that.
Discomfort's the name of the game.
Yeah.
So
well, I think we have pretty much this. Well, most of my colleagues are sublimely oblivious to these issues. And those of us who are not sublimely oblivious tend to be stakeholders with our own positions. Where I would like to see more of my colleagues is beginning to generate our own movement that occupies that same space, the same center. And I'm happy to say that there is, in fact, an organization that has begun to do that just recently, an organization emerging out of Amenu called the Third Narrative, which does exactly what we just have been talking about, avoids these two extreme poles and recognizes the virtue of pursuing that middle road. And I think that provides us with a very fine platform from which to articulate a position that I believe people on college campuses are hungry for and will be receptive to. In other words, the conversation has been hijacked by the extremes who suck up all the energy and create a sense of fear if you question one of those two positions. In a certain sense, those two extremes have a shared interest. Raise the temperature. It's very good for business. But I think what we have to do is try and carve out a space between those two polar opposites where a silent population, maybe even a majority, dwells, and empower them to speak and be heard. And I think faculty have an important role to play alongside our dear friends in J Street U to model exactly that kind of commonsensical, but at the same time in the current environment, courageous middle way, the golden mean.
thank you.
I want to
Go ahead.
address, if you will, if
Please.
you'll allow me, I want to address this current polarization with what happened. Of course, it didn't start with the Conference of Presidents rejecting J Street, but I think it sort of brought it to this boiling sort of minute. And I have to say that I would want to see, and that I think goes to the responsibility that Israel and Israel leadership has towards its diaspora, not its, but the Jewish diaspora communities. I would want to see a responsible Israeli leadership that realizes that Israel has turned into this horrible dispute that is, excuse my language, starting to tear the community apart. And I would want to see an Israeli prime minister who is able to see this and to realize that, if not for anything else, if he didn't realize it up until that point, that it was, for the many, many years, it's been tearing Israeli society apart. But when it starts affecting diaspora communities in the way that it does, this, I think, should have been the wake-up call, the big, big wake-up call for an Israeli prime minister to realize that this cannot go on, and that he really must end this impossible situation that Israel's been in for the past, increasingly in the past 47 years. And be able to come to this community and say, okay, let's see what we can do in order to try and really work this out. Not only, of course, in terms of what's happening within the community, but the way you are reflecting what is happening in Israel and with Israel. And I think part of the tragedy is the fact that we have a prime minister in Israel that thinks that this serves him politically. The polarization within the American Jewish community, he really feels, probably him and other right-wing factors, that this is working for their best and is only, again, worsening the situation rather than really working in order to heal everyone and everything. And hopefully, when this leadership changes, we are able to do this too.
David, far be it from me to leap to the defense of Prime Minister Netanyahu, but it needs to be said that settlement building has been undertaken for 47 years by governments of different political stripes.
Sure. No, I wasn't talking about settlement. I think he thinks that that not accepting J Street into the conference president works for is good for him personally.
And I guess what I would add to that, no, I completely agree about that. What I would add would be that we've seen an erosion of Israel's moral standing over a 47-year period, not over a 5 or 7 year period.
Oh, for sure.
And that is what is echoing back now to diaspora Jewry and is reflected so palpably in that JPPI report.
But it is happening on his shift. I mean, it's true, it's not only him, but it's happening on his shift. And not only doesn't he see that he needs to address it, but he thinks it's...
Yes, it's certainly reaching a crisis point on his watch.
So that actually comes to, for me, another core point and a question that we have here for you. And it relates to the question of Jewish peoplehood. I'm old school enough to believe that Israel is the collective enterprise of the Jewish people. That's my approach to Israel. Therefore, that means I have a stake in it. I have an obligation, and it also means I have a say. Not the same as if I were living there, but nonetheless, I have a stake, I have a responsibility, I have a say. The question is, for Merav, do Israelis share a sense or have a sense of Jewish peoplehood? You touched on this a little earlier. Or is their sense of Zionism really more about patriotism, which is, I think, Israeli patriotism, rather than Jewish peoplehood? So if you could sort of respond to that in terms of this sense of peoplehood, which I think drives, I'm guessing, many of the people in this room, and how that is addressed or considered in Israel today.
So yes, I touched on it before, and I would say that it's ambivalent. Like on one hand, yes, Israelis have this sense of peoplehood because, and especially when the whole, now it's becoming again all about the Jewish state, and the word Jewish is being used much more extensively, and I would say maybe too much, of course, in Israel. So, and as I said, as opposed to the regular existence of diaspora communities which are not being reflected in the media in Israel or in other ways in the public life at all. Whenever there's an anti-Semitic incident, wherever, this would get like huge headlines. And that would be totally conceived as like something that's against us. It's not that. I mean, Israelis totally feel responsible when anti-Semitism rises. But at the same time, yes, there is this division, that it's not the same. And that, as I said to you, because of the fact, what happened with Jewishness in Israel, this dichotomy between secular and religious, and that the fact that we don't have, it's very easy to not practice any any kind of religious Judaism in Israel, because the Pharesia, what we call the public sphere, is so like Jewish. The calendar is, when it's Shabbat, it's the holidays, so it's very easy not to have to practice anything, and people don't consider that. I mean, it's becoming considered more Israeli than Jewish. So it's like, it's complex and ambivalent, and there is a commitment, sort of, but I think it comes from where Israelis are still clinging to the role of the victim. So not only as Israelis, but also as Jews. And I think that's not good enough, unfortunately.
So one more question for you, although I think this is one that you both, I would love to hear your take on it as well. The question refers to the enormous political fundraising for parties like Habayit HaYehudit and for generally that side of the spectrum, fundraising in this country to support that political agenda, which is interesting because certainly one of the knocks and criticisms that we've been talking about is this issue of meddling in Israeli politics, and here we're looking at enormous sums of money, and you referenced this as well earlier, supporting a different agenda. And the question is, what's being done to harness the energy to organize American diaspora support for progressive Israeli political parties, or I would broaden that, a progressive Israeli political agenda beyond what's happening here, but actually in Israel?
Well, I'm here now. No, that's not what I meant. Sorry. That's not what I meant. What I meant is I'm inviting you to, yes, by all means, do whatever you think is possible to be done in order to support progressive, and I don't mean progressive causes. There was this panel in the morning, the opening plenary this morning, and they were discussing what can we do. So yes, I think there is a lot of support for progressive causes and NGOs who do empowerment of minorities and work on human rights and civil rights, etc. What we need now, I'm afraid, I mean, it's extremely important work, and but I think this will not bring about the change. We need support that is much more political oriented and much more sort of blunt, I would say, saying we support progressive parties, progressive candidates, and we believe that they are an alternative and can and will very soon will replace the current regime in a non-right-wing regime, which is, I think, our number one responsibility to do, and what we are asking you to support.
Yeah, it seems to me there are two issues, David, in that question. One is the question of money in politics, which is a very, very troubling and difficult one. And I can't say that I'm supportive of more big money being poured into political campaigns here or in Israel. The other point, though, is the meddling. One person's meddling is another person's constructive engagement. And I'm all for that kind of constructive engagement. I think that's exactly the kind of commitment and involvement that we should be encouraging, that is an antidote to indifference, because Israel is just too damn important to the Jewish project to give up. We have to redouble our commitment, our engagement. And you know what? I would not restrict that engagement to, as much as I would like, to my political perspective. It actually is across the spectrum, and we have to be prepared for that. So I'm all for whatever you want to call it, meddling or constructive engagement as a reflection of our deep commitment to the project of Israel as part of a much larger vision of a global Jewish nation or people. And I think we should be encouraging it, and we should really see it as a tool to bring in and empower those who feel marginalized by the current discourse.
I have a 2-minute check, so I want to give the panel a last chance to add any final thoughts before we wrap up.
You go first.
I return to the family metaphor with which you began. We Jews in the diaspora have a strong familial bond with Jews in Israel, with the Jewish people in Israel. And as a result of that familial bond, we have both the right and the obligation to express our concerns, our gratification, our sense of pride, all together. And I think what that means is that we here in this room are very much embarked on a healthy path, and a path that has the potential to lead us out of the current darkness in which we find ourselves.
Okay, thank you.
I want to, one thing that I think has sort of been running through this conversation, particularly in the beginning, is something about the tension between being both Jewish and democratic. So just to leave us with an idea, which is, I think we've created in some ways a false distinction or false dichotomy between these two, that the values of the Jewish part is going to services and having and Jews having control of the Kotel Plaza and running it like an Orthodox synagogue if they want to, and having national holidays on Shavuot. Okay, the democratic part is the pluralism and the civil society and one person, one vote. And those are two, and the reason that we feel so much tension is because we see those in opposition. And I would just offer a much more robust understanding of the ways in which many democratic values are actually drawn out of Jewish values, Jewish texts, and Jewish tradition. And so these very ideas, the idea that there's a multiplicity of possibilities and truths, that we need to make space for argumentation, for diversity of views, for equality, for human dignity as the center of the conversation, that's not democratic more than it's Jewish. That's both. And so I want to offer, we don't need to live in all of that tension, but instead to try to build out a much more robust Jewish conversation that can actually hold all of those ideas itself.
Did you have any? Merav.
So I want to add to that, that I want to very carefully, if you will, because as I said that Israelis don't like to receive criticism. I suppose you don't like it very much either. But I think there's a sort of, I always feel that there's like a mirror image between the politics and society, the things that are happening in Israel in terms of society and politics, and what's happening within American Jewish community. I mean, it's a little bit, it takes some years maybe after, but it is following the same kind of dynamics. So I urge you to, look at us and see what the things that you think we are doing wrong. Maybe you can come up with ideas how we can do it differently. We are very open to this. So first of all, try not to repeat our mistakes here. And secondly, by all means, any idea that you have about anything that we can do differently in order to change the situation, we're very open for these ideas. And the other thing is, I want to encourage you, the same way I want to encourage my own society and politics, to have many, many more women, much more prominent in the discussion and in the conversation. So, it's not that you guys aren't fabulous, but I think the voice that Sharon, Rabbi, you don't mind me calling you Sharon, is those ideas, exercising the space for multiple voices and being able to hold them together and to coexist, everyone, is really crucial to what we want to achieve. And women are such an overwhelmingly important part of this process. Don't look away from this. Both women who have to step up and lean in, and both men who will have to make the room for them.
Yes.
So I'm sure everyone joins me in thanking our panelists for what's been a really rich conversation. Thank you. Thank you. Rachel.
Thank you so much for that really fascinating conversation. I was saying to Ira as I was sitting there listening to Rabbi Brous, I love, with the Jewish and democratic thing, I love when find easier ways to deal with my cognitive dissonance of uncomfortable Jewish issues. On behalf of J Street, I want to say thank you to all of our panelists and our moderator for your insightful and thoughtful remarks, and just some quick housekeeping announcements. For all students here at 4 o'clock in room 205, there's going to be a debriefing conversation, so after your next session, make sure you go there at 4. And please note that some sessions in the next set of breakouts will be full. If you pre-registered, please go to the one that you signed up for, and please try to get to your session early in order to secure your seat. Thank you.